Welcome back to another episode of Opal Wave MTG, a channel dedicated to exploring power levels in EDH and helping you tune your deck to your meta. I'm your host Jacob, and today we're going to be checking out Stax in EDH and how to manage it across the power level spectrum. If you want to see the deck list for this, that'll be in the description below. And as well, if you want to support my channel, be sure to check out my Fiverr, that'll be in the description as well. And let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to address is what is Stax. And Stax is a term that is used for cards that deny your opponent's resources. And this was first coined by a card called Smokestack, which was used in a deck that also used cards like Mishra's Workshop, which is a land that taps for 3 that you can use for artifacts to power out really powerful resource denying cards like Smokestack, as well as Lodestone Golem, which makes all non-artifact cards cost 1 more to choke your opponents out of resources. And from that, these cards have been called Stax pieces. And there are tons of different types of Stax pieces. And Stacks generally get a pretty bad rap in terms of EDH just because of they don't let you play the game, more or less. But there is actually a spot for Stax pieces in EDH, and that's mainly because it helps balance the other archetypes. So like with combo, it really helps slow those decks down so they aren't going off too fast before the rest of your playgroup can even do anything about it. Even if you aren't playing a Stax deck in particular, running a few Stax pieces that you can break parity on is always a good idea. And by breaking parity, I mean basically you can play around these Stax pieces very easily. So if we take like a collector, for example, it says activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. It's not a hard thing to include if you're running a green deck that's primarily ramping with mana dorks and or land ramp. And if you don't want to be that rude, quote unquote, to your opponents, you can always run something like a blind obedience, which will slow down your opponent's artifacts, their creatures as well, but slow down their artifacts, but they still get to use their artifacts, so it's not as much of a feel bad. And this is kind of this idea of like a hard Stax piece versus a soft Stax piece, where a hard Stax piece is going to tell your opponents that you just can't do something, as opposed to a soft Stax piece, which is going to slow your opponents down. It's going to be annoying, but they still get to use their resources. It's just going to be on a delay. And this concept of soft Stax pieces versus hard Stax pieces can help balance power level in your playgroup. Like say you've got a Marin deck that's in your playgroup and it's continuously outvaluing everyone else at the table. Well, wouldn't be a bad idea to run some kind of graveyard hate, like a Rest in Peace that would exile all graveyards forever. Or you could do something like a Ground Seal, which just makes it to where players can't target cards in graveyards with spells or abilities. So while the Rest in Peace is going to take out that resource out altogether, Ground Seal is just going to stop them from using the resource temporarily until they can get rid of the Ground Seal. That way it's less of a feel bad. So if you're in a play group where you don't really want to be that harsh on your opponents, but you still are tired of getting outran by these kind of graveyard type decks, Ground Seal could be a pretty good option for you in that case. And the next thing I want to talk about was ending the game in Stax. And one of the main reasons why people don't like playing against Stax is because it just makes the game drag on for forever. So if you want to avoid that, you can use your Stax pieces and mix and match them in a way that can actually just either lock your opponents out of your game entirely, and at that point you can just say GG and move on to the next game. So if we're talking something about maybe like a Marilyn of the Morn Song, which stops players from drawing cards, but at the beginning of each player's upkeep they get to search their library. If you pair that with an opposition agent or a Stranglehold, they can't draw cards and they can't search their libraries. So whatever's left in their hand at that point is it. And especially if you have an opposition agent, you're just going to be tooting your opponent's libraries every turn, and you pretty much got the game on lock from that point on. Another way we can, utilize those Stax pieces and mix them together to close out a game is something like an Omen Machine, which also says players can't draw cards. At the beginning of each player's draw step, they exile the top card of his or her library. If it's a land, they put it in the battlefield. Otherwise, the player casts it without paying its mana cost. Well, if you pair an Omen Machine with something like a Draenith Magistrate, which we've got right here, where players can't cast spells anywhere other than their hand, so they can't draw cards and they can't cast a spell off of the Omen Machine, while you will be able to cast cards off of the Omen Machine. So again, we're locking the board out of using their resources, and at that point you can just win the game. Other ways, generally with these Stax decks, there'll be hate bear type strategies, so overrun type effects like Craterhoof Behemoth or Triumph of the Hordes, great ways of closing out games. You can also just use efficient combos that play around your Stax pieces. So if you are primarily playing Rule of Law type effects, something like a Kiki Jiki combo could work really well, since you don't have to cast that many cards to actually get the combo going. And once you do execute the combo, you don't need to cast cards anymore, since you just need Kiki Jiki plus the one card that can untap the Kiki Jiki, essentially, depending on how you're setting that up. So in the stack list, I've separated these cards into different types of Stax pieces. So here at the top, we've got these anti-draw type effects, which, you know, if your opponents are drawing a lot of cards and just outvaluing you with like a Consecrated Sphinx or something like that, these cards are really great for stopping that extra card advantage so they can't get ahead of you like that. Then we've got anti-tutor cards, which are really great if your playgroup likes to tutor a bunch. Stranglehold being my favorite, since it stops your opponents from taking extra turns as well. And some examples of artifact hate. Again, we've got the Blind Obedience and Collector Oof, as well as the Karn, which will stop your opponent's artifacts from being activated. So it's like a one-way kind of stacks. Then we've got the Kataki and the Energy Flux, which will make the artifacts cost, you know, it will give them an additional cost at the beginning of their upkeep, and if they don't pay it, then they have to sacrifice those artifacts. So pretty brutal against decks that are all in on those Stax plans for sure, or artifact plans rather. Creature hate. Again, we got this Blind Obedience, since it will make creatures into the battlefield tapped as well. Stuff like Crackdown and Meekstone can make the creatures just, they don't get to untap anymore. Cursed Totem and Limvala stop opponents' creatures from being activated, period. If you want to buy some extra turns and not take any damage from your opponent's attack steps, something like a Peacekeeper, which just says creatures can't attack, you'll be pretty safe. Smoke. Players can only untap one creature during their untap step, pretty great. And then we've got these cards that just stop ETB effects like Hushbringer, Hushring Griff, Takatli, Honor Guard, and the Torpor, which are all very powerful in stopping decks that really care about ETB effects. In the next section, I've got some Forced Tap. If your opponents like to do hasty beatdown type strategies, these can be really nice just for slowing down those cards, especially against something like Xenagos, where they want to, you know, put something big down, give it haste, and double its power. At least you get that extra turn before it starts beating your face in. Other cards like Manglehorn and Root Maze can be really good against those storm type artifact decks that, you know, want to play an artifact, draw a card off of something, and then, you know, cast more artifacts on top of that. Back to our graveyard hate section. More ways to exile our opponent's graveyards, like the Silent Gravestone, Dathi Voidwalker, and Dryad Militant can stop cards from going to the graveyard as well, and the Sanctifier Invec can do that also for red and black permanents. The Samurai of the Pale Curtain can also just stop permanents from going to the graveyard as well. All very powerful effects. Again, we've got that ground seal. If you want your opponents to still have access to those resources, they just can't use them. So at some point, if they get rid of the ground seal, they can break free of that essentially. And Denic is also a nice option if you don't have green for the ground seal. And then these are kind of just hard Stax pieces. Angel Jubilation and Yasharn, you can't pay life or sacrifice permanents for costs. Draenith Magistrate, a very strong card in EDH, since you doesn't let opponents cast commanders from the command zone. Phyrexian Revoker and Pithing Needle both are very targeted, where you name something Scheming Fence as well. You get to name something and then players can't activate cards with the same name as the card you named. Titania's Song makes it to where the artifacts are just creatures now, with and they can't activate their abilities anymore. Sire of Insanity basically just rips out hands, so players don't have hands for the rest of the game. In the land hate section, Back to Basics, Stasis, Static Orb, these kind of cards are going to stop our opponents from actually untapping their lands and using them that way. Cards like Magus of the Moon, Contamination, and Blood Moon are going to actually just make it to where your opponent's lands don't tap for the color that they need to. And these are all, pretty harsh Stax pieces, but when used effectively can be very powerful. And in this next section, I kind of wanted to touch on these cards that aren't really Stax pieces, since they aren't stopping your opponents from using their resources. These are cards that you essentially gain an advantage when your opponent does something, and I refer to these as parasite cards. There might be a better name out for them than that, but stuff like Archivist of Ogma or Deep Known Terramancer are really good at gaining card advantage, or for ramping like Deep Known Terramancer, but essentially they aren't stopping your opponents from doing anything. You're just gaining an advantage when your opponent does something. So there's a slight difference there. Not exactly a Stax piece, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Then in this next section, we have Punisher cards, which essentially punish your opponent for doing something. And your life total is a resource, and some decks do utilize that life as a resource. Decks that use Necropotence or Ad Nauseam or other cards that require paying life in order to do something. So if you can hit their life totals really hard, it makes it to where they actually just won't be able to do the things they need to do anymore. Stuff like Pyrostatic Pillar. Basically, every time you cast a spell with 3 or less, you deal 2 damage to that player. Or stuff like Ruokthar, and you cast creature spells, you're going to take 6 to the face. Or even Karavik, if you were played against this guy, he's really strong, being able to just dome anything he wants to whenever any player plays the spell. It's got a high casting cost, but a very powerful card in its own right. And these cards can be really great if you don't have access to very many Stax pieces. These cards are traditionally in like the red, green-red kind of colors. Colors that don't have access to stuff like Rule of All effects down here, which will, if you can't slow your opponents down, you might as well punish them in some regard until their life totals are so low that they actually just can't use their other resources anymore. Then we've got our Rule of Law effects, which are named after the original being the Rule of Law, which just says each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. Cards like Archon, Eidolon of Rhetoric, and the Arcane Laboratory are basically pretty straightforward copies of this card. Cards like Deafening Silence are interesting in a way that you can kind of play these in more creature-based strategies if you want to cast multiple creatures in a turn, but if you don't want players catching more than 1 non-creature spell in a turn, card is great. Aethersworn Canonist as well if you're playing an artifact-based strategy, where you can cast a lot of artifacts, but your opponents most likely or hopefully won't have a lot of artifacts they can kind of cast in a row. So you're gonna restrict them on that resource, and you get to break parity on it as well. Then moving on, we've got the sphere effects, which are traditionally named after the Sphere of Resistance and the Trinisphere. And these cards essentially just make other spells cost more. So stuff like Aura Sphere, the Chill, making red spells cost 2 more. Some of them are more specific, like the Dove and Hand of Control. Some of them are a little bit more generalistic. Trinisphere, anything that costs less than 3 is going to cost 3. The Sphere of Resistance makes everything cost 1 more to pay. I did include Suppression Field and the Eidolon of Obstruction in here. While they don't make spells cost more, they do make abilities cost more. And I thought that was worth mentioning in here as well. And then lastly, we've got just straight up Stax. And if we are going to think of Stax in a more traditional, based on the original card that it was named after, Smokestack, These are cards that make everyone sack a creature at the beginning, or sack something at the beginning of their upkeep, essentially. So cards like Anno on the Ruin Sage, we've got the Sheoldred, which makes each opponent sacrifice a creature at the beginning of their upkeep. Periphery Nodes can destroy a creature with the lowest power at the beginning of your upkeep. Destructive Flow hits those non-basic lands, and then the World Queller can also, you just choose a card type and make each player sacrifice something. And generally when you're playing these kind of strategies, you're thinking, you know, you've got some way to play around them, like you're doing a token type of strategy where you'll always have more creatures on board than your opponents, or you've got like a Crucible World so you can replay your lands in case of the Destructive Flow, something like that. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to talk about in this video was answers to Stax pieces. So how do we play around these Stax decks? How do we play around Stax pieces? And one of the best pieces of advice I can give when playing against Stax decks in general, or playing against a Stax piece that hits your deck really hard, is to be patient. Eventually, you will find a piece of removal that can interact with that Stax piece, and then you will be able to play the game before. Now, it's really important that when you find that removal for that Stax piece, that you are the first person that gets to utilize your board once the Stax piece is gone. Simply removing a Stax piece when the person next to you in the turn order can then go off on their turn because that Stax piece isn't holding them back either. You want to make sure that that's not going to be happening. So highly recommend, you know, instant speed interaction being used on the turn before yours starts, so you gain full advantage of the new board state without a Stax piece on it. And cards like Back to Nature, which can destroy all enchantments in case of like enchanter style decks. Fracturing Gust can be really sweet since it hits enchantments and creatures. Targeted removal, instant speed type of stuff. You just want to make sure that you're really you're hitting those cards at the really opportune moment. Sometimes, you know, if we're not being patient against these Stax decks, it's really easy to get frustrated. And if you're getting frustrated, you're going to be making rash decisions, and you're not going to be, you know, making the best decisions that you can. So slow the roll down just a little bit. Really think, you know, calculate when the best time to use your removal is, or even just see if you can win through the Stax pieces. I always enjoy playing against Stax pieces because it almost comes off as, you know, like a puzzle. Like, how do I navigate this puzzle? Some people, you know, not everyone is like that. I understand. But it's always fun for me. Another really great answer to Stax decks is just board wipes in general. So I've said this a few times on this channel, but Cyclonic Rift is so good against Stax pieces. Generally, you know, if you're just, you know, if there is a Stax deck, they're going to have a lot of Stax pieces on the board, and sometimes just one removal spell isn't going to be enough. So something like a Cyclonic Rift, where you can just bounce everything, get a clear start on the board, especially when you at instant speed, you get to untap, just have a fresh board and play out your board, can be really great. Stuff like Bane of Progress or Austere Command, you know, will definitely get rid of a bunch of Stax pieces. Damnation, Day of Judgment, these cards as well. Hour of Revelation will, you know, against Stax decks, not too hard for there to be 10 or more permanents on the battlefield. So for 3 white mana, you're just going to blow up everything. Get a really great reset. And if you can do that, you can generally get ahead, because the Stax pieces rely on getting these Stax pieces out and then continually slowing you down. But if you can get ahead of them in that regard, it can be hard for them to kind of lock the game back up from that point. And another question that I kind of get asked is, you know, why run multiple of these like rule of law effects, or why run multiple of any kind of Stax piece? And that's primarily because when you are running, you know, a Stax piece, you want to make sure you find that Stax piece as often as possible. So when you're running multiples, you know, it's really great so you can find that Stax piece. And then if you do find like another Stax piece, you can just play that card on top of it. So now if your opponent only has targeted removal, that one piece of removal isn't going to be enough to get rid of the rule of law effect that they desperately need gone, because now there's an Archon of Emiria out that stops them from playing another spell on that turn. So it makes, one, it just helps find that piece faster, more consistently, and the other is in Stax decks, it's really not a bad idea to make the water wet and make sure that your opponents can't play through that kind of stuff. Thanks for checking out this episode of Opal Wave MTG. Again, I'm your host Jacob, and until next time.